Who am I? How to answer this question is at the heart of personal identity. And personal identity is vital to social anxiety disorder, as has been recognized in the DSM. The DSM has also recognized that identity is deeply cultural, and it includes reference to what is described as a presentation of social anxiety disorder that is specific to Japan, Taijin Kyofusho, or TKS. And this is usually analyzed in terms of different cultural constructions of the self that affect anxious cognition. So one problem with this is that what it means to be a collective person as opposed to an individualistic one is often misunderstood. People think that individualistic people somehow care less about their relation to others. I want to suggest today that they care in a different way, in one that may be perhaps more insidious with regard to anxiety. I'm going to talk about culture in a transnational way, actually, the culture of capitalism. These kinds of identities are not static. Western formations of the self are actually spreading along with capitalist systems globally. They make shyness and reticence appear problematic, and they make personal identity less easy to ground in stable external factors by corroding a lot of existing structures and atomizing society. So the answers to that question, who am I, become more internal and less certain. My talk is going to draw on my master's research, which was a comparative cultural phenomenology of social fears. I talked to European American students and Chinese international students at the University of Chicago. I've also just returned from a year and a half of ethnographic and textual fieldwork in Beijing, primarily. When I was talking to Chinese youth psychotherapists, going to a lot of self-help groups in China to see how personality is constructed as an object of concern and intervention, and how all of these processes are involved in Chinese history and in the influx of Western ideas and social economic structures. So let me begin with a little observation upon my return to Chicago from several years in China. On public transit, people would brush against me very lightly and go, sorry. There's this kind of politeness that I actually found very disturbing. Nothing happened. In Beijing at rush hour, there are people employed at some stations to push you into the trains. And I thought, this is making something out of nothing. It made me a little nervous. So, admittedly, this is the Midwest, and that's a little weird, even if you're not from China, if you're from somewhere a little closer. Someone like me who's from Philly. I think there's a little less thank you here, and that's why I'm so glad to be back in the conference. There's a lot of space for the self, physical, and also in terms of defining who you are in relation to others in America. I discovered that when Chinese students arrive in America, they perceive that people are always trying to be funny, witty, even in very passing, fleeting interactions. Like in the hallway, you can't just say hello, it's got to be like, hey man. And that's tough to grasp. You don't have, you're always performing in some sense. And the American students I spoke with, it did seem that they had internalized these norms. There's a pressure to be witty and actively social. I spoke to 6 American students. 5 of them reported acute anxiety in situations that would not necessarily even be defined as explicitly social. Places like standing in line, waiting in the hallway before class. Being actively social was seen as a sign of health. Being quiet or reticent is seen as something that condemns the self, something shameful in a very deep way. This is bizarre. How do people come to care so much about how strangers see them, or what happens when you pass somebody in the hall. I think, again, with decentralizing the idea of the West versus the rest, we need to look at actually Western, particularly American, anxieties as something deeply bizarre. In China, as in most pre-capitalist societies, there's a degree of inclusion and embeddedness in family and community that is assumed. This was also brought out in Dr. Gomeriga's talk. The list of values that he listed as traditional for Latinos could overlap very well with what gets characterized as traditional Chinese values. Removing these scaffolds of identity creates a space for anxiety, but I want to suggest that this is not a simple cultural critique, because the need to define yourself is dependent on the ability to define oneself, and this is something that we do deeply value. So China's most famous anthropologist, Fei Xiaopeng, he called China a society without strangers. Mobility was very low, and most of your interaction was within a very circumscribed sphere. Even through the Communist Revolution and into the 90s, even if you weren't in a village, in cities your life revolved around work units called danwei. These controlled your work, your housing, your entertainment. Everything was in this circumscribed community. And Chinese social anxieties, based on a small, but there are some studies out there, and my own experiences and research show that these anxieties often are about facing authority figures or parents, fears about specific problems in office politics, fears about specific social relationships rather than who am I in some more abstract sense. This picture is from a music festival in Beijing. The label up there, Dashan Square. Dashan is a term which means to pick up a girl or a guy, or even just more generally to talk to strangers. Can you imagine an American music festival labeling a social area as Talk to Strangers Square? No, we assume this in some sense to be a normal mode of social life, but it's not in China. This attracts controversy. There are online groups where it's debated whether or not Dashan is legitimate. People don't like being imposed on necessarily in that way. It's presumptuous. Attaching importance to relationships, even fleeting ones, is somehow embedded in the sociality of strangers in a more mobile society, and in a kind of view of the self that has a particular history of a modern nation state in which people are connected to their citizens before all else, and therefore could potentially enter into voluntary association with any other citizen. A universalist religious ethic, Confucian ethics, are very rooted in specific relationships. How are you to act morally to your parents, to your siblings, to superiors? And capitalism, competition, a low-context society. So on your left, these questions I think might be more typical in most societies around the world. On the right, these questions, which I might add, am I getting what I want? Am I having as much fun as I should? Am I being perceived as cool? These questions on the right can be asked all the time, and they have no final answer. How will you ever resolve your doubts about who you might be for other people? The eminent cultural historian Warren Sussman, who taught across the river at Rutgers, he has a famous thesis. He did a lot of research on self-cultivation manuals in America, and he showed that in the early 20th century there was a shift from discussion of character to discussion of personality. Personality is about being, in his words, fascinating, stunning, attractive, magnetic, glowing, masterful, creative, dominant, forceful. It's the quality of being somebody, he says, and also of being yourself, of course. And these kinds of standards for self-evaluation only make sense for people who are operating in a very low context society, which we are, so I hope I'm very charming. In a culture of character, reserve is not necessarily problematic. Reserved styles of interaction, it's even a sign of good breeding. But again, things are changing. Chinese culture is not being erased. It views the person and relationships very differently than we do, and it will. It doesn't have a whole history of the frontier, the Protestant work ethic, legacy of slavery, immigration, the politics of identity, all the things that are particular to America. But there's something about the historical development of capital, this process about mobility, competition in labor markets, that is causally related to a desire to be extroverted and a felt existential need to create one's identity. This creates a strong incentive for people to become more extroverted for reasons that are often derided as materialistic, to get ahead at work, but also for self-actualization. You can take advantage of more opportunities. You can meet more people if you are more outgoing. These anxieties about being shy or reticent in China are not peripheral to cultural production. They actually structure a wide range of discourses and practices about personality. Parents are worried about making sure their kids are confident and have high self-esteem. Educators are exploring ways of getting children to be more expressive. Reformers at the highest level of the Education Bureau are piloting all of these programs to increase emotional expressivity. This is in the name of creativity, competitiveness, entrepreneurship. Students themselves are concerned that they're not getting enough opportunities in the Chinese educational system to express themselves, to speak out, public speaking, and they're worried that this affects their chances in life. Popular psychology is how most people in China, the greatest number of people in China, encounter psychological concepts. Some of you may be sad to hear that. But that's the case. People are reading self-help books in enormous quantities. They are about 40% of the top-selling books in China. Things like The Secret, things like Think and Grow Rich, The Willpower Instinct. Many young white-collar professionals, even college students, even kids still in high school, are very concerned about learning Western ways to communicate, speak directly, smile. Ethologists call that behavior in primates a fear grimace. I don't think it's direct correlation, but there is some evolutionary history here. And this group, for instance, is a self-help group in which I was a member. So they're learning, let's see here. People are learning to constantly appeal to the good graces, not just of parents or authority figures, but of everyone, actually. This group is, hold on, slide's a little rusty. This was supposed to, I just went through all that. Anyway, this woman on the subway is reading Dale Carnegie. I saw a lot of people on the subway reading these books. I happened to snap this one. So the title of Dale Carnegie's famous work, which has found such enormous audiences here and abroad, How to Win Friends and Influence People, I mean, it sounds like it was written by someone deeply anxious about how others view him. Since 2001, Dale Carnegie Training has opened offices in 8 Chinese cities. Another American organization that started in the 1920s, Toastmasters, now has 40 clubs in Beijing alone. This organization is a network of franchise clubs where people go to practice public speaking as a way to get over their anxieties. It is also often a kind of self-therapy for social anxiety. It also purports to teach leadership skills. I have to say, it seems to work for some people. Just through practice, they do get better at facing audiences. So So this is actually from a Toastmasters group. Globally, the organization is growing fastest in China and India, by far, by large margins, and it suggests that it's tied to emerging middle classes who are being integrated into these labor markets. So for people in these groups, overcoming shyness or reticence becomes a focus of anxious attention, a key to the truth of themselves, of becoming who they feel they are inside in some way, to success in a job interview or another market interaction like a date, for instance. Let's see. So across many spheres of work and love and meaning, who you are is becoming dependent on your vigor, your ability to compete, and even the value of your difference from others. The market brings possibilities, but makes it difficult to find identity and recognition. Being unique is a part of this. Is anyone out here still waiting for tenure? Probably. You have to sell yourself as being different. In another day and age, most of us at our ages would probably have our feet quite firmly on or under the soil. We have a long extended period of self-definition, whether or not we want one often. So these are some terms that have a lot of currency now in China, youth culture. And you can see how much attention is being paid to being different and to being authentic, which is pretty remarkable in a place where people are still often referred to just by their social role. Teacher, uncle, brother, three. These are ways that people refer to each other. Now there are hipsters in Beijing. My God, there's like one of the lanes has a fixed gear bicycle and jumping shop. This lighter says non-mainstream. And so there's even already a level of irony about the need to be different. If you call somebody an artistic youth, that was good 10 years ago. Now everybody thinks they're posers. So despite this cynicism, there's a real freshness to discourses about individualism in China. People read articles with titles like How to Be an Interesting Person. They talk very earnestly about the need to have hobbies. I heard a group, a self-help group, a speech called Apples and Onions about how everyone else is an apple, but it's okay to be an onion. And this speech became a real touchstone for members of this community and other clubs around it. And this kind of message is preached online and in youth salons and cultural activities in China. It resonates with a lot of people and is seen as a kind of cultural critique. Self-help may be derided, but it is powerfully motivating. People want to assert the value of pursuing their passions and having great conviction in themselves. There's an almost disconcerting ardor with which people talk about this. Everyone in China knows about Maslow's pyramid, and they want to self-actualize. They want to travel, to volunteer, to choose their job, to take advantage of all these resources for creating who they are. So they know about Maslow's pyramid, but a lot of them are trapped at the bottom of it by crushing material circumstances. Even in the middle class, competition is intense. Speaking of bottoms, sex is another realm where there are now more possibilities for self-definition. Have you ever had an ONS? Do you know what that means? A one-night stand. Everyone in China knows what that means. Why do foreigners go to bars? Is it just to try to have sex? These are questions that foreigners get asked in China. And they hint at how new a lot of these social freedoms are and how laden these spaces are both with possibility and anxiety. This young woman, semiotically linking here tattoos with autonomy, has a message of loving yourself and loving sex. She's involved in the Chinese version of vagina monologues. Again, these very Western narratives of the self and identity. She's here speaking at a conference about marketing to youth. It seems that this kind of self-possession and confidence sells. The conditions that make identity so fraught and contested are also those that embody values to which many of us are committed, of meritocracy, egalitarianism, diversity of lifestyle, autonomy, independence, and self-actualization. So there's no simple cultural critique here. I'm going to conclude just a few more comments. The question of personal identity is central to attempts to understand social anxiety because cognitively, it is an anxious concern with one's social self. Capitalism greatly increases mobility, stripping away existing sources of identity. It sets up new ideals of self-promotion and marketing in competitive social and economic environments, ideals that become central to self-evaluation, extroversion, charisma, and style become fetishized. This places also a lot of burden of creating identity on the individual. And the fluidity, contingency, and contestability of identity in this environment makes anxieties about the self very difficult to resolve and spreads them across all social space. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, wrote that the thing about an inwardly derived personal original identity that doesn't enjoy this recognition a priori, it has to win it through exchange and it can fail. What has come about with the modern age is not the need for recognition, but the conditions in which this can fail. I don't know if that's completely true empirically, but there's something there. Christopher Lasch famously characterized America as a culture of narcissism, saying in his argument that the breakdown of traditional values led to a self-centered culture. That is not my argument, but mine is somewhat parallel, that I see the collapse of traditional sources of personal identity as leading to a constant search for oneself, understood in a very alienated and reflexive way. This is not pure narcissism because it's a response to real demands created by the breakdown of social structures and by the real need to compete with others, many others, in larger social circles than existed before, historically. There's a cultural critique here, beyond those of enemy, alienation, and inequality that are wrapped up in this, is that we have to learn to judge ourselves so constantly and in ways that cannot find satisfaction. When are you sufficiently cool or interesting? The problem was relevant to a cultural and historical taxonomy of social anxiety, in my view, is that under these conditions, we seek ourselves in each interaction, however fleeting, and not in more enduring social relationships. So all space becomes personal, a constant call to create ourselves, drawing us out so that we can know ourselves. It's an echo space for our desires and for our fears. Thank you.